So we are going to talk about these very, very low mass stars down here on the main sequence. But first, let's summarize what happened before with the low masses, like our sun. Burns hydrogen on the main sequence, just like every other star on the main sequence. And once it runs out of that hydrogen, it's going to collapse the core, heating it up so that the helium will burn into carbon. And that's what happens here in the giant phase. And then once it runs out of that helium, it can no longer burn something in its core because it doesn't have the mass to gravitationally crush that carbon into something else, so it turns into a white dwarf. Right? Very small, very hot, but not burning helium or anything else in it. Right. And then cools off into black dwarf. Same idea for these guys. All right. These guys are much smaller. They burn less fuel, so they will last much, much longer times. In fact, the idea is that these things could potentially outlast 1 trillion years, all right, on the main sequence, burning their very limited fuel very, very, very slowly. But they're still burning hydrogen into helium, just like our sun. All right. So these little red dwarfs slowly sipping their fuel, but eventually they will run out. And when stars run out of fuel in their core, those cores will collapse and try to heat up to burn the next level. Well, these are so small that they don't have the gravitational muscle required to actually burn that helium into carbon. So, but as they do get smaller, they get hotter and will eventually become into a white dwarf. Now, these white dwarfs are going to be different. Obviously, they're going to be less massive because they're 0.25 down to about 0.09 solar masses. But they're also going to be made out of only helium, not carbon like the regular low-mass stars. So we have a helium white dwarf for these very low-mass stars. But the fate ends up the same. These eventually cool off and turn into a black dwarf. In this case, it'll be a helium black dwarf because it's made out of helium. And that's how the very low mass stars are going to work. They go in main sequence for much, much longer times, maybe upwards of 1 trillion years. Fusion stops, collapses, heats up, turns into a white dwarf that is made out of helium. That helium white dwarf cools off to a helium black dwarf.